Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. In the coming decade, the nonprofit sector is set to see a massive turnover in leadership as the boomers retire. Indeed, sector experts say this trend started during the pandemic as many established leaders opted for early retirement. How can the sector be more intentional about succession planning in order to build sustainable organizations? What does it take to build a succession plan, attract more young people to the sector, and build better pipelines for recruiting boards of directors? Joining me to discuss these important issues is Jen Vachon, the Director of Programs and Advocacy for Fora, Network for Change, an organization that delivers programs and opportunities that prepare the next generation of leaders to amplify their voices in decision-making spaces. Jen has extensive experience with equity-focused programs and development and coordination in a variety of roles. A lifelong passion for local and international social justice has been the driving force behind Jen's work and study, which includes international development, community development, and economics. Welcome to the podcast, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Can you tell us about the work that Fora does with the Rise on Boards program?
Sure. So, in short, we work with young women and gender marginalized youth across Canada to provide in depth leadership and governance training that they then use to engage in a 1 year board placement with a nonprofit board anywhere within the country. Throughout their placement, they receive mentorship from a board member that's within the organization, like within the board that they're placed with, as well as a coach that we've matched them with. And we do that to really set them up for success within that 1 year placement. So through the Rise on Boards program, participants are really able to expand their networks, gain new knowledge, while also using their skills and experience to positively impact organizational decision making and the communities that nonprofits serve.
Great for their CVs too, I'm sure. What kinds of challenges do young and diverse women face when it comes to sitting on boards or gaining leadership positions in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, so there's a couple that stand out in my mind. One is just like young women, gender marginalized youth being viewed as lacking in experience, and like the experience that they do have, school, work, volunteer, lived experience, that being devalued or not being deemed as enough. And board members not like thinking that that type of experience isn't really applicable to the board work that they're doing. So that's a big one that we hear when we're trying to get those board placements going. And, it's really interesting. I was looking up some stats earlier, and there's like 86,000 charities across Canada, right? Registered charities. But yet it's quite difficult to find 35 board placements every year. So that just kind of, I think, speaks a little bit to what I've just mentioned. And then the other main challenge I would say is that once young women, gender marginalized youth get on boards, sometimes they face tokenization or other forms of discrimination by members of the board that haven't quite developed an equity-centered mindset. So like people turning to these new board members as like EDI experts because they're one of the only or like the only racialized person on the board as an example. Or assigning tasks like note taking versus having them like really engaged. Like those sorts of things can happen. We've heard of these things happening with young folks joining boards.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think some women could echo that experience as well in their own sort of journeys on boards. Finding that voice and being able to engage in a more meaningful way. What can organizations do to better welcome young and diverse women into their organizations and ensure that they're included in decision making or consulted with in some of the decision making that a board might take part in?
Yeah. I think it's important to recognize that everyone has different needs and, approaching people differently in terms of, what they need in order to be able to engage meaningfully and effectively. Simple things like inclusivity within meetings. So like seeking input from everyone, maybe doing like a round robin type of discussion, ensuring that everyone has the chance to speak. I think a big thing would be training for organizations. When I talked earlier about what we do with the Rise on Boards program and the training that we provide to the participants, the program participants, another big component of our programming is providing training to the boards themselves who are going to be working with the young women and gender marginalized folks to be on their boards, to ensure that they are ready to have younger people on their boards and create safe spaces for them, and engaging and welcoming spaces for them. And so I think, another big component, like I mentioned earlier, of the program is that mentorship piece. So we make sure that for every person that we place on that 1-year board placement, that there's a board mentor who's there to like really guide that new person to the board throughout that 1-year placement. And so I think there's a few different things that can be done to better welcome young and diverse women into their organizations.
Well, on the contrary, do you have examples of what some organizations have done well?
Yeah, for sure. So I think like the first thing that I had mentioned in your last question was just recognizing that everybody has different needs. And so I think something that we've seen come out of COVID, or like especially I would say with COVID, is that flexibility piece. So recognizing the value of providing guidelines, some guidelines with work arrangements that allow for some flexibility and accommodations for everyone that's on their team, that work for everyone on their team. Based on their different needs. So just like truly recognizing that everyone's lives are different. And that's a big piece that really helps people to immensely thrive, like at home and at work, or as a volunteer board member, as an example. I would say, those sorts of the flexibility piece is a big piece.
Now, as we mentioned off the top in the introduction of this to this discussion, the nonprofit sector is really facing a looming succession crisis in leadership. What do you think needs to be improved to be able to build better leadership pathways for young people to enter into the organizations and actually develop their career within organizations or join organizations in a leadership capacity?
Yeah, I think there are a few different areas that really need to be improved. So one I would say is informal learning opportunities. And again, that's what Rise on Boards really is it's this informal learning opportunity, but more informal learning opportunities. We can't expect everyone to go to post-secondary for like nonprofit management or something like that, as an example. So more leadership development programs that focus on challenges in nonprofit management. So looking at things like fundraising, governance, community engagement, those sorts of pieces. That folks can really learn from and use to sort of bolster their or to like build better leadership pathways for young people. I'd say that the other piece, like I've already mentioned a couple of times, is that mentorship piece. Mentorship and networking opportunities are huge, I would say. And we really do see this within the programs at Fora. So using Rise on Boards as the example, someone has a good experience in their first year on a board. They've been supported by a mentor and a coach, and then they go on to stay on the board beyond that 1-year board term, and oftentimes take on executive board positions like the treasurer role or chair, vice chair. So really seeing like the benefit of that mentorship piece really paying off. And then lastly, I think like switching up mindsets, which can be difficult to do, but that's where that like training piece comes in for board members, as an example, in terms of providing like equity training. So we have like the people who are currently in decision-making roles who get to decide who goes into leadership roles. We need to be able to shift mindsets and understanding there of what leadership looks like. And there needs to be a willingness, of course, to kind of have that mindset shift from people at organizations and around board tables.
Now, do you see the sector as an attractive career choice for young people? And if so, why or why not? And I guess the second part of my question would be what you're hearing from your program participants. What do they think of the nonprofit sector as a career choice for young people?
Yeah. To be perfectly honest, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I've heard varying things, but in general, I think what I hear is that a lot of young folks, young women, gender marginalized youth, they care very deeply about the work that the nonprofit sector is doing to address the various issues that we see locally and globally. And so I think that there are a lot of young women and gender marginalized youth that are really driven to nonprofit work because they really want to enact change, and they're very passionate about contributing to making those issues obsolete or improving, the situation around the world. And so I think that the nonprofit sector is attractive in that sense. However, this sort of work is very tiring, especially when folks are so passionate about it. And we do see in the nonprofit sector a high burnout rate. And so I think, on the one hand, some young people are really encouraged to come into this sector because of the types of work that they can do. But I've also heard from some young people that they are a little bit discouraged by the sector because of just the rates of burnout. And so I think that there needs to be mechanisms in place that enable this hard work and this passion, but also enable rest so that people avoid that burnout and can continue to do this important work. I've heard from some young folks that they feel the nonprofit sector is leading the way in some of the policies and organizational changes that need to take place in order to ensure that people can do this important work, but have opportunities to disconnect and rest.
Well, that is partially encouraging. I'm glad that they feel that the nonprofit sector is leading the way. But you're right, there is a lot of talk of burnout in the nonprofit sector. A lot of people take on more than they might in a private sector or a public sector kind of role because of their passion. Do you have any thoughts on what the sector might be able to do to better attract young people to both paid and volunteer roles? I mean, that's often how they enter outside of organizations and programs like your own. A lot of young people, join as a volunteer and then become an employee. What do you think the nonprofit sector has to do better? Because, it is a challenge to actually attract young people these days to roles within the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, definitely. I love that question. So I think that from just my experience, what I've seen, I think creating a culture of wellness, and I'm thinking at work, but that could apply to volunteer roles as well. But I think this culture of wellness is very attractive to people in general, but including young people. And it's no secret that the charitable sector oftentimes can't or doesn't pay salaries that are competitive with other sectors, which, to your previous question, I've also heard is a bit of a deterrent. But I think the sector needs to start demanding better pay for the work that's being done, and that, can be reflective in grant applications that the people in these positions are applying for, and just, applying for higher salaries as one sort of option. And I know that's a bit of like a medium to longer term thing, but in terms of like stuff that can be done immediately, there are sort of wellness policies that can be put in place. So even if a charity isn't able to offer like exactly a competitive salary compared to like the private or public sector, things like giving more vacation days or more sick days, implementing wellness days within your organization, like mandatory wellness days for everyone across the organization. Things like shopping around for a better benefits package that's within like an organization's budget. Some organizations I've seen are eliminating probationary periods for medical and dental benefits. So I think all these sorts of shifts in policies and approaches are attractive, like I said, to people in general, but including young women and gender marginalized youth, that, women making up the majority of the nonprofit sector. Earlier I mentioned like that flexibility piece, like flexible schedules, flexible work arrangements. And then lastly, I would say for like both paid and unpaid work, so volunteer positions as well, I think young people, want to have a true say in how the work is being shaped. So even if it's not young folks in leadership positions, just like being in whatever position you're in within the nonprofit sector, like, having being asked for your feedback, and it not just being a performative act, like, but actually implementing that feedback, and having people being able to take on the lead roles and sorts of development and implementation of different initiatives. I think these are all things that can be done to really attract young people to paid and volunteer roles.
It's a really great and thorough answer. How are programs like Rise on Boards helping to develop leadership pathways for young women? And how does it open that door or open mindsets to allow for that to happen?
Yeah. So in a few different ways, like I mentioned earlier, like the program really does hone in on expanding their skills, knowledge, confidence, and networks that truly do end up driving their leadership trajectories. So for the training component, we train them in things like negotiations and imposter syndrome to really help with their confidence in those different areas. Everything surrounding board governance, so fundraising, financials, board governance 101, professional communications. And then we also train them how to navigate tokenism and microaggressions for when those situations, if they do come up within their board experience. But of course, those are learnings that they can take beyond the board experience and really into any sort of role that they're in. The Rise on Boards program, goes beyond just the training component, and they get that real world experience, which I think is huge in helping to develop those leadership pathways. So through their 1 year board placement and all the experiences that they gain through that, and all the opportunities that come through engaging with a nonprofit board in that position. Expanding their networks is huge. So within the Fora community, so every year that we do a cohort for the Rise on Boards program, participants are engaging with 34 other incredible young women and gender marginalized youth doing like incredible things in their communities and across the country. And so expanding their networks with them, with our alums, with who they meet on the board, their board mentor, their coach. So it's really, really opening them up to other opportunities in that sense as well. And then lastly, like you had mentioned, like that sort of shift. How do we go about that shift in mindset that really does help to develop those leadership pathways? And one of the ways we do that through Rise on Boards is that training that we do with board members. So in Rise on Boards, our regular program, we've also developed a pilot. We've done a pilot model of a sort of cloud-based asynchronous version as well. But so in the regular Rise on Boards program, any board that signs on to work with us and take on a 1 year placement, at least 2 members of that board have to participate in the equity training that we provide. And so I think, over time, we're helping to shift those mindsets across boards for folks that are in these leadership positions, where they can then like advocate within boards, but also in all the other sorts of positions that those people hold, for greater inclusivity.
I love the fact that you're not just providing training to the participants in the program, but also the boards that they'll go on to. I think that's marvelous. How can nonprofit organizations get involved with Rise on Boards?
Yeah, so like I mentioned at the beginning, there's like 86,000 registered charities or something like that across the country, and it does get a little bit difficult every year to fill those 35 1 year board placement positions. So any board that is looking to engage with a highly trained, enthusiastic young woman or gender marginalized person, they can get in touch with us to engage with us in that capacity, to take on a 1 year board placement. And then I, spoke very, very briefly about the pilot test that we had done of the asynchronous version of Rise on Boards. And so as part of that, we're building up an e-directory of boards that are interested in engaging with young women and gender marginalized youth on their boards. So this would be a resource that anyone going through that self-paced program can access at the end of the training to try to secure their own board positions. So there's a couple ways that boards can get involved with us.
Well, I think that was a great opportunity to give your pitch, and you did it very well. It
Thanks.
seems like a great opportunity for any board in the nonprofit organizations in the sector in Canada. As we wrap up today, I'd love for you to look ahead 5 to 10 years. Do you feel optimistic that we'll see more young people, especially in your case with your program, young and diverse women, engaged with a leadership work in the sector?
Yeah. So I one of a nickname that a family member has given me is EO, which stands for eternal optimist. So I'd have to say yes, but I think with good reason. I think there's a lot more attention being given to this by organizations and programs than ever before. I think there is a greater understanding of the value of having young and diverse women and gender marginalized youth engaged in leadership work in the sector. And so I want to say yes, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, but I recognize that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. And shifting those attitudes is going to be a lot of work, but I think we're on the right track. So yeah, I'm feeling optimistic.
Well, Jen, the succession crisis is such an important challenge for nonprofit organizations to address for the continued survival of the sector. And your work at Fora, developing young leaders, is such a crucial part of the solution by developing the leaders of tomorrow. Thank you for your insights and advice. And thank you for joining us at Charity Village Connects.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.